Also got the chance yesterday to speak with Hawaii's Governor, Josh Green. He was in Maui. We didn't expect this conversation. He's a doctor, and we happened to see him as he was making his rounds at the War Memorial Complex, where evacuees are taking shelter. We got the chance to ask him about the conditions in Lahaina and the continued search for victims.
There are more fatalities that will come. The fire was so hot that what we find is the tragic finding that you would imagine, as though a fire's come through and it's hard to recognize anybody, but they're able to determine if someone did perish.
The reason I ask about the conditions in Lahaina is because the town has been hard to reach. Residents have to prove a need to be in there.
Yes.
Journalists are not going in. But when you describe it the way you just did, it's clear why.
I can share. I've twice been in. I was there Thursday and then yesterday, and I chose not to go into Lahaina today. To be totally honest, there's nothing to see except full devastation. So the buildings are almost non-existent. It was so hot that even metal contorted so that you can't believe what the building was. But that's what you see, and obviously there will not be any survivors in the area left. They've either escaped that night. And now, as we put up some temporary cell capacity, people are calling each other, so the number of missing went from in the 2000s down to 1,300. And look, our hearts will break beyond repair, perhaps, if that means that many more dead. None of us think that, but we are prepared for many tragic stories.
So conceivably, this could be hundreds dead.
They will find 10 to 20 people per day, probably, until they finish. And it's probably going to take 10 days. It's impossible to guess, really.
Hawaii has confirmed that the sirens didn't go off.
Yes.
And cell warnings, television warnings may not have gone through.
Yes.
Are you frustrated that there wasn't a better system to alert residents to get out?
Of course. I've lived here for 23 years. I've heard the siren go many times, never for a fire in my case, but for tsunami warnings and for volcanic eruption warnings and earthquake warnings. We're heartbroken that people couldn't get out or didn't get alerted. We are doing a comprehensive review already. My Attorney General, I asked her to do it, not to find fault in anyone, but to say why this worked and this didn't work.
But you would still call this disaster a natural disaster, not man-made?
I would. It is definitely a natural disaster because the winds were moving any fire between 60 and 80 miles per hour. That's a mile a minute.
And the wounds in there, I'm sure, are not the kind of wounds you see from burning your hand on the stove.
No, they're much more significant. Yeah. And an interesting thing and a tragic thing here is we're not treating more first, second, and third degree burns because the fire was so perilous that it took lives, it didn't leave survivors.
Wow.
That's really what you're experiencing. When you see mostly fatalities and very few injuries, that tells you it was a natural disaster. Like if you put a fire truck in the way of the flames that were coming through at 1,000 miles an hour, the fire truck would have been incinerated in addition to the people.
Yeah.
So it's unlikely that much could have been done except, of course, moving people out before, and that's what we'll talk about.